Okay, hi, I'm Keisha Kinnicker, and I will be presenting on the history of mental illness and the way it's been treated throughout the ages. So, first of all, how many of you people know someone who's been diagnosed with a mental illness, whether it be depression, schizophrenia, anything? A fair number. Okay, so in America, there are actually 1 in 5 people with any mental illness, which would qualify as something of depression, anxiety, a phobia, anything of that sort. And there are 1 in 24 with an SMI, which is a serious mental illness, which would qualify as schizophrenia, a personality disorder that would keep them from actually functioning in the real world. It's very debilitating. So the major categories, according to my psychology textbook, is anxiety, somatoform, which is, somatoform is like a hypochondriac. Their mental illness is, I wouldn't say released, but shown as a physical, they take it out physically. So for example, I work at Hillcrest. We have someone with somatoform mental illness. She is diagnosed with having seizures, but every once in a while, because she has a personality disorder, she will fake one for attention. Dissociative, which would be something like sociopathy or an antisocial personality disorder. Mood, which would be depression, manic, bipolar, and then schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, which are the more serious ones. A personality disorder, which would be like a borderline personality, and a lot of people don't know, it's hard to describe borderline personality disorder, but it's more of, here's A, here's B. You would say, I like that book. If you said that to someone that had borderline personality disorder, they wouldn't understand because they love it or they hate it. And there's no in between. And then there's sexual ones, so pedophilia, substance-related illnesses, and cognitive disorders, which are more or less someone's thoughts and beliefs affecting their daily life. And the most common mental illnesses are the top ones according to the ADAA, the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. Generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, social anxiety disorder, a specific phobia, so she hates spiders, arachnophobia, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, to be like your veterans, and major depressive disorder and persistent depressive disorder. And the difference between these two is, okay, major depressive disorder, it usually stems from something that's happened to you. It's kind of like post-traumatic, but it's lifelong. Where persistent depressive disorder, which used to be called dyspnea, that definitely stems from something that happens because it'll last around 2 years or more, but it eventually fades. And the different perspectives on psychology and the disorders are biomedical, which would be treating something with a drug, behavioral, which would be conditioning someone to change their behavior, psychoanalytic would be like someone sitting down in a therapist's office and how does that make you feel? Why do you feel that way? And cognitive, which would be, I don't personally agree with it, but changing someone's thoughts and beliefs to modify the way they act. And the timeline of how mental illness has been treated in the past starts all the way back to 5000 BC. And the first thing they did when someone was acting abnormally and they're like, you're weird, they would trifle them. So by trifling, I mean they took a stone and a bigger stone and they'd crack a hole in their skull, and that would release the evil spirits that were making them abnormal. And a lot of times the people would end up not being able to function at all because they've lost part of their brain. They can't even function anymore. And then in ancient Mesopotamia, they went away from the stone and the axe. They weren't putting holes in people's heads anymore, but they would exorcise them or pray over them to get out an evil spirit. The Hebrews believed that it was God's punishment for sin, and they would essentially tell them, you know, you have to do so many Hail Marys and so many Our Fathers to get rid of this. My personal favorite, ancient Egypt. When women have a baby, they have postpartum depression. Their justification for the woman's hysteria was that she had a wandering uterus after birth. It knocked it out of place, so it was floating around. Well, to get it back, they would hold fire under her to lure the uterus back to its original place. And then in the 5th and 3rd centuries BC, thank goodness, Hippocrates came along and he said that supernatural forces are not the causation. It's within a person's brain, their chemical balance and their hormonal balance is off. And then the Dark Ages come, and they would do bleeding of the body. So essentially they would take these people and they would put holes in their arms and their legs, and they would bleed them out, thinking that if, you know, the person bled enough, whatever in there was making them abnormal, it would leave. But eventually people would die of so much lost blood. And then in 792 CE, the first mental hospital was established in Baghdad. And this mental hospital is obviously not what you would see today. They had terrible conditions. They would chain them up so far up against the wall they couldn't move their arms, they couldn't move their legs, and they would even chain their necks. So essentially these people they could just move their arms enough to feed themselves, but they were not able to lie down, so they would sleep upright. They treated them like absolute animals. They wouldn't clean where the person was sitting, so they'd be usually laying in their own bodily fluids and stuff like that. And then in the 17th century, they thought, well, you know, we're not actually really doing anything for these people, we're just kind of keeping them out of society. So they're like, okay, let's try something. So they would use amulets, like a necklace, that would wade away the evil spirits, once again. And then they would use hot or really cold water to shock the person out of their abnormality. And after the 17th century, the mental hygiene movement came along, where people were saying, we are not treating these people right, nothing we do is making them better, if anything it makes them worse, and it's just basically taking them out of society so no one has to deal with it. So they went through, because by this time there were probably 50 or so mental hospitals that were established. So they went through, the doctors that decided they were going to do this, went through and took the chains off. They were able to do recreational activities. They were taught about their illnesses more, as much as they could be anyways. And they essentially were, you know, treated as human beings, more or less. So after all that happens, everything's going pretty well. It's not perfect, but it's much better than it was. Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis come along. So what do you guys think of when you think of Sigmund Freud?
Cigars.
Cocaine? Yeah, cocaine. Sigmund Freud comes along and he thinks that, you know, everything, there's the id, the ego and the superego, and the id is your most primitive part. It's mainly sex and aggression, and that's way subconscious, but everything you do, a little bit of your id comes out. So your ego and your superego are controlling that, making sure, you can't do that, that's not socially acceptable. So he thought essentially that most of these people were controlled by their id, and the reason for their mental illness was because they had pent-up sexual aggression or just pent-up aggression in general. So he would talk to these people, and he didn't really help them very much, but that was his theory. And then comes along, and this is not very long ago, shock therapy and lobotomy. So, have you ever heard of an ECT? They would do it that way. They would put them in a chair, connect them to all these electrodes, and shock them. And they still do this today. I actually have clients that get this for stabilization. But it was much more severe, and people still today, they suffer from amnesia. A lot of times their IQ will drop significantly from it because they're just killing a bunch of neurons. And then lobotomy was another big thing that they did. Lobotomy is essentially taking probably a needle about that long, and they would either drill holes on opposite sides of the head, or they would put it right next to the eye socket and pop it in there and wiggle it around to try and cut ties between neurons to keep people from being so aggressive, which obviously led to people it would debilitate people a lot, and they couldn't even, a lot of times after lobotomy, people couldn't function and they would get put back into the mental hospital. And then JFJK comes along and is like, we already know that it's because of the hormones and the chemicals in the brain. Why don't we come up with something that will, modify this? So then come along the first psychotropic medications, which were Valium and Thorazine, both of which are helpful with anxiety and psychosis, usually a mood stabilizer. So now, today, the treatments that we have are psychotherapy, which is basically just going to a therapist, talking it out. And normally after psychotherapy, the therapist will analyze someone and say whether they need more therapy or do they need to go to a psychiatrist and get prescribed medication, which is the biomedical therapy. And then behavioral conditioning. In psychology, there are a lot of different spaces between the belief systems, and you're either biomedical or you're behavioralist, and behavioralists believe that you can modify anybody's behavior in any amount of time and they're going to behave better. Or there's cognitive treatment, which again is modifying someone's beliefs to modify their behavior. So these are the most common psychotropic drugs. A lot of these are antidepressants or anti-anxieties. That's a big antipsychotic. And I'm actually shocked Haldol's not on here, but Haldol is a very large antipsychotic. It's good stuff. And then amphetamine salts, which help with ADHD. So, in conclusion, we know more than we did about mental illness and how to treat it, but psychologists believe that we will never fully understand the human mind and why it does what it does. We can get close, but we'll never get completely there. And this is a quote from Jane Pauley: "My goal is to see that mental illness is treated like cancer."